SVC Media.
Welcome to the iGaming Daily Podcast, analysing the news from the betting and gaming industry all over the globe, supported by Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming market.
Welcome to the podcast. My name is Sue Schneider, and I'll be your host for this. First of all, let me talk about Optimove. It's the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming market, and it has 56% of the EGR Power of 50 personalized player experience with Optimove. And as a special offer, Optimove are offering new clients a free first month when they buy Optimove. For more information and to claim the free month, go to optimove.com/SBC, and links will be left in the podcast episode description. I'm really pleased to have Mark Blandford on. We go a ways back, and part of what I'm trying to do with this series that I'm doing is talk with some of the veterans and the pioneers in the industry and give people a flavor of what it was like in the early days and how things have evolved. So with that, welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Sue. And can I just say, what a pleasure to be your first ever podcast guest. Thank you.
It's exciting. Hopefully I don't mess anything up. That's always my big fear. But let me talk about, I remember getting a call from you way back, talking about, hey, there's this thing called the internet. And you come into the industry with some history in sports betting. So can you talk a little bit first just about your personal and family history as it relates to that, because I think that was a precursor to you starting Sportingbet.
Yeah, you're right. So I am, in fact, would you believe the 4th of July this year, I describe the 4th of July as my Independence Day. That's the day I got my bookmaker's permit 40 years ago on that day. So 4th of July, 1984. And I bought a betting shop, a retail betting shop in the UK, a small backstreet shop, quite frankly, all I could afford, and set about building a small chain of shops. So we were primarily taking bets on UK and Irish horse racing and some greyhound racing. And even in those days, 1984, we weren't allowed to have TV screens in the shops, because that might encourage people to come in and watch the racing and bet.
Oh, no.
The original legislation for betting shops going back to the 60s was only to allow the minimum for the purposes of conducting your business, i.e. placing a bet. The notion in that first wave of regulation of encouraging people to stay in shops, i.e. by showing live pictures, was discouraged. In fact, it was illegal.
And where was it that you were doing this?
Oh, this was in the West Midlands in England. The first shop was in a town called Malvern. I then subsequently bought a couple of shops in a town called Hereford, which is my local town, where I was born, where I was educated. And then we subsequently added a couple more shops before I sold out to a national operator. And they in turn sold to Corals. So my shops ended up as Coral shops. I was quite happily doing the same thing again, probably with a better quality estate in South Wales. And we were doing a couple of other things. We had a standalone telephone betting operation. We were amongst forerunners for using some non-cash payment systems. And life was good when towards the end of 96, the internet came into my life. And to tie back to your earlier comment, I reckon we spoke in early 1997.
Mm-hmm. Well, you truly are a pioneer when you hear even about your history with the land-based stuff. So what drew you to exploring internet as a means of delivery for sports betting products?
Yeah, so the first thing was there was a lady who lived near me who'd been employed on a project which was to bring the internet to local businesses in the rural area where I lived. She persuaded me to go along and have a look. My business training in college had been international marketing, and I think that helped me understand that here was a new distribution channel that would work in the industry in which I was already working. So I do have to say it was something of a light bulb moment. That was at the end of 96. I then quickly got into doing a lot of research, and I found a certain website where I believe there was a reporter by the name of Sue Schneider, if I remember correctly.
Right. Editor, actually, but close enough.
Oh, sorry.
You demoted me already. Let's talk. No problem. Talk about, people talk about the early days as the Wild Wild West. I mean, there really was little to no regulation. So how did you, as you began to do your research, how did you look at where you were going to locate and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so from our point of view, being in the UK, we had regulation. I had to be licensed as an individual to take bets, and each premises had to be licensed to be deemed to be a suitable premises. So it wasn't really driven by regulation. The big factor in the UK in those days was that we had a tax on the stake of 9%. So for every pound wagered, there was a 9p cost in terms of tax, which the bookmakers collected and passed on to the government. Realizing that if I chose to base my business in the UK, and as I expected the industry to develop, I saw that with servers, it was going to be a portable industry. It could choose to operate from wherever it wanted to. I also knew that in the UK Channel Islands, there was no betting tax. So long story short, we got one of the first batch of 4 licenses that were issued by Alderney in the Channel Islands. In fact, we were license number 2. So we relocated everything and we went there. And that's where Sportingbet started, Alderney. Moved out there in early 1998, and we were trading by October 1998.
Great. And you were among the first. I know there's always some discussion on who are some of the first out there. I think Intertop's probably beat you by a little bit out of Antigua. So things were happening kind of quickly at that point in terms of where people were establishing their domicile for those operations. And I remember talking to you about Alderney, and you were saying that was a little bit of a challenge to get customer service that was 24 hours because you were able to be global from your customers. So I know there were challenges for you.
Yeah, I mean, there were limitations out of working on an island of 2,200 people. I certainly would not claim to be the very first bookmaker globally. I think you're right. I think it was Intertops. We actually, I think, took our first bet on something like the 18th of October, 1998. Now, I wasn't actually the first UK-based bookmaker or British Isles-based bookmaker, but I was the first one who survived. There were a couple ahead of me. There was no tech to license. Technology and payments were a big challenge, but I was the first one who survived.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you look at those earliest days, I mean, what were the biggest challenges for you?
It's probably the technology and payments that I mentioned. If you walked into a UK high street bank and mentioned bookmakers, gambling, internet in the same sentence, they couldn't really get you out of the bank fast enough. And the other thing was there was no European style or UK style technology platforms to license. So for sports betting, this was only sports betting to begin with. We didn't build a casino platform. We literally had to come up with the scope for the whole thing. That took time. I was working on that sort of 97, early 98, and we were building 98 during the time I was relocating and setting up operations in Alderney. So payments was a challenge. We knew we needed credit and debit card processing. And whilst there was a fledgling offshore industry, of North America, that didn't really apply to us because we didn't have those initial banking relationships. We solved it almost by accident by discovering that Microsoft had basically set up an e-commerce unit out of Denmark that was helping early fledgling businesses. Clearly, they wanted to promote people using their technology for the internet, and they enabled card processing. So that's how we ended up initially solving the problem.
Mm-hmm. And how long did you have Sportingbet the whole time? How many years did you have that?
So I left the board, I think, in January 2007. And as you will know, that was just a few months after UAGA passed. But as the founder, then I still had a shareholding in the business. And it was actually acquired by a combination of William Hill buying some of the regulated assets and GVC, who bought the unregulated or pre-regulation assets. And that was around the start of 2013, January 2013, I think it was.
Mm-hmm. And you're still involved with the industry, more as an investor or advisor at this point. Can you talk a little bit about how you've evolved into that side of the business? Because clearly, like me, you can't stay away.
Yeah, so I suppose if people ask me what my job is today, I would say technology investor. I would explain that we know we like scalable tech platforms, but there is definitely a bias to businesses that are in and around gaming. We also have some other B2C, and we do some other industry verticals, things like fintech, for example. Yeah, so that's the sort of the day job these days. I have investments in a couple of operating businesses, but there's also, payments, digital marketing. It's a matter of public record, for example, that I'm chairman of the gambling.com group. That is a NASDAQ listed business, very successful in the world of performance marketing. And I give you that as but one example.
Mm-hmm. If you look back to, again, the challenges that you had, I mean, clearly as regulation grew, as, people got into other regions and other countries in the world, the U.S. clearly stands out as kind of an odd spot because I know for me, when I had my company, we didn't do any events in the U.S. because they were very phobic about it. And then, we had other issues related to Carruthers and, a variety of things. But I know you did a move at one point to try to get the U.S. to see the light in terms of regulation and taxation. And it's taken a long time beyond that. Some of the efforts that you were involved with. I mean, what was the rationale behind trying to get the U.S. to really look at this in a way that was going to benefit not only the companies, but the local jurisdictions?
Yeah, so we were always, from a fairly early stage, we're involved in the US market. We were licensed out of Antigua and of course, there was a trade agreement through a number of Central American and Caribbean countries with the US that provided that loophole. We realized, though, that the US did not welcome the industry, that it had sought to be, depending on your point of view, prohibitionist or protectionist. And we just felt that it made sense to try to explain to the powers that be that there is a way that gambling can be regulated to provide safety nets for the vulnerable, be that those who may have problem gambling tendencies, underage, obviously, and questions of affordability. So what we did in the early 2000s was that we began a lobbying campaign in the US. In fact, I went over to Washington several times lobbying, met various senators, House representatives and their staff members. And we also ran an advertising campaign in a couple of the main newspapers, I think, in New York and Washington. And the campaign was entitled, "Please, Sir, Can I Pay Tax?" I think it's well understood globally, particularly in more recent years. It's tax revenue that get gambling regulated. We realised that. So we tried to attract attention to the fact that we wanted to pay tax. We wanted regulation because we saw that as the long-term sustainable way forward for the industry. And we wanted to be responsible operators and provide those safety nets for the vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. Well, it just took a decade or two. They finally came around. So forced into it, obviously, by the Supreme Court. If you look back over your times as a founder and running Sportingbet, I mean, what were some of the more rewarding things that you can look back on at this point?
I think there was a whole series of things, really. I don't think there was one single defining moment. I think it was a series of steps, and that probably starts with getting the license in Alderney, getting the technology to work, taking our first bet, taking our first international bet, adding an interactive casino, moving into poker. These things all happened in sort of 3 or 4 years. So if you like, we were hitting milestones almost every year. And then it became, we became a junior public company. We caught the stock market boom for internet businesses. So those were milestones in those terms as well. We listed on London's over-the-counter market in 98, on the London Stock Exchange in early 2001, just one of the last .com businesses just before the internet crash. But we were able to raise funds. We were able to increase our reach and improve our product. Getting international marketing, opening new operations in different markets. Those early 2000s, by 2001, we'd relocated a head office function to London, and we'd started hiring all of the customer service staff in London, because London's a great place to hire the language skills needed. And I think over the next sort of 5-6 years, we got up to about 30 odd different languages in terms of customer service being run from our offices in London. So the whole thing was quite, it was a real ride, but these were all steps on that journey.
Mm-hmm. What was the most fun part as you look back? What part did you enjoy the most?
I used to, as a bookmaker, I used to enjoy going down on the trading floor, particularly, say, midweek when we would have some big games going on that night. In our case, it was primarily soccer in the early days, but obviously as we grew in the US, it became US sports as well. Mm-hmm. Seeing where we'd got a big position on a game, and then I do admit I would sit down and watch the game where we had to sweat a big result. That was fun. But the whole thing was stimulating all along. You know, the culture in the business and the people we had in the business made the whole thing a lot of fun. I think we all had a sense that what we were doing was exciting. It was cutting edge. And as the business grew, you know, beating records, there was a really great culture in Sportingbet in those days. So the whole thing was fun.
Mm-hmm. And if, again, looking back, are there any regrets or any things that you feel like you would have done differently with your knowledge today?
Look, I'm sure there are things we could have improved with the benefit of hindsight. But I do consider myself fortunate that more things worked to one degree or another than didn't work. So I've sort of, you know, I'm very thankful for that. But I tend to be a forward-looking person. I'm looking now at the next generations of technology and where, for example, things like artificial intelligence are going to take the industry. And other real neat sort of automation solutions that we can use for everything from regulation efficiency, marketing efficiency, trading efficiency, etc. So, looking forward to what's to come, probably more than looking backwards, if I'm honest.
Well, that's probably a good plan. Let me ask you this. I keep running into 20-somethings who are very talented and have very creative ideas and are anxious to get into the industry. If you were talking with some of these young people and they do have an interest in joining, then what sort of advice might you give them as they try to find their niche in the industry? Today, it's a very different industry than when we were starting.
It is. In the early days, there was a sort of a sense that we were all in it together, whereas now, as the industry has matured, it's much more competitive. I think your choice of the word niche there is very relevant. You need to find a market opportunity. I think you need to find the market opportunity, and you need to be capable of developing a plan, an operating model that's going to serve that efficiently. So, I would say the industry is still very entrepreneurial. As an investor known to make investments in and around the sector, I am never short of people coming to me, contacting me, sending me business plans, or have launched the startup. That's the phase we actually like as investors, when a business is in its very early stages, but it's actually got trading data, because it makes it so much easier to model a business, to understand the business, and quite frankly, to value the business. So I would say to people, definitely come on in the waters fine, where I suspect, like any tech-based industry, where we're nowhere near maturity. The industry globally is still growing. The product is becoming more sophisticated. And I think it's new people coming in with fresh ideas that help that process along.
And we're running out of time, but I do want to ask you one other thing as it relates to regulation, because from my perspective, while the industry has moved forward, the regulatory processes have not so much. When you have people that are operators that are multi-jurisdictional and they're bringing box loads of paper into one jurisdiction after another, I mean, it seems like from a regulatory standpoint, we could use some innovation also. Do you have that same perspective?
I do. You're absolutely right. There's the light hand regulation. There's the heavy-handed regulation. It feels to me as though the UK at the moment is probably at the heavier end of the scale. And then there's complications. I don't know if you were referencing the US, but where gambling regulation is regulated per state, and each state wants to see a tech stack in its own jurisdiction, it doesn't half make things inefficient, and it's unhelpful from the point of view of the economy of scale of being, if I was to have an ambition for the US market, it would be that there'd be some kind of federal legislation that would standardize and simplify. And then I think what you would do is you would see a lot more innovation coming from the reg tech, the regulation technology people, to not only meet those needs, but to surpass those needs in terms of the functionality that would get developed.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great way to end up here. You have made my Virgin podcast a very painless experience, so I really appreciate that. And we hope to see you again in the future.
Yeah, not at all, Sue. And thank you for some great questions, some thought-provoking questions as well. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to today's iGaming Daily Podcast, supported by Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming market. If you want to find out more about some of the subjects raised today, feel free to explore any of the sites in the SBC News Network or check out the latest edition of the SBC Leaders magazine. Happy reading.